This was the first tactic. The second was possible to raise from the dead the corpse I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And the second tactic is retrieving the tradition. It's impossible to start afresh. What has been believed and can't be believed a second time. But if we have a look at what happened to pro-Catholic theology in the 20th century, with the very interesting facts. Some are editorial facts. Let us mention one. The publication, which started in France in 1943, when people had probably all the things to do than publishing books. But anyway, in 1943 started the publication of the series Source Chrétienne, Christian Sources, which aimed at retrieving patristic studies and more precisely patristic exegesis. And this is a momentous event. Something else had happened. I was not thinking of it, but I had my distinguished colleague mentioning it. It was the rediscovering of liturgy. As a matter of fact, after the Gothic period, Catholic theology had forgotten that liturgy had a theological importance. It has simply isolated worship from the whole of theological work. If you have a look at the monastic school or canonical school, the 11th century for instance, you will discover very quickly that students and professors speak to each other, discuss, teach, and so on, but also pray with one another. These had disappeared. And these reappeared in the consciousness of theologians in the 20th century. And it was the great merit of a few German theologians and monks, mostly from the Abbey of Maria-Laach, to have rediscovered that in fact one cannot abstract, for instance, the sacraments from the liturgy of the sacraments. You don't understand what the Eucharist is and means if you don't understand how the Eucharist is celebrated. That was a second tactic. One finds it also in Eastern theology, for instance, in the so-called Eucharistic ecclesiology, where again scholars, I name one who is not a great scholar but who managed to make a name for himself, namely John Zizioulas, and Zizioulas describes in loosely speaking phenomenological terms the church, and the church is gathered praying and celebrating the Eucharist. The church is not an abstract reality, but this very concrete reality here present in this chapel. So, and the third tactic was of course possible. It was retrieving the scholastic philosophy and theology model. And that's the tactic which was followed in the Roman Church after the first half of the 19th century. Believing that it was possible to do in the 19th century what had been done till the 16th century, with the result that instead of scholastic theology, one got neo-scholastic theology, and that instead of scholastic philosophy, we got neo-scholastic philosophy. And so totally fossilized philosophy and theology, cautiously conserved in seminaries or philosophical universities where more or less no recent philosophy or no recent problem was present. For after all, the only decent problems were the medieval problems. But anyway, this was anachronistic but possible. I'm criticizing it from the conceptual point of view. It ought to be criticized on another point of view, namely, it leads necessarily to another conflict of faculties. If you start afresh founding faculties of philosophy and faculties of theology and putting that there is a dividing line between both, in the end you will find philosophers dissociating themselves from the work of theologians, and theologians on their side doing bad philosophy. Looks gloomy, doesn't it? The rest is not. And I turn abruptly to 20th century philosophy. It's sure that theology is no science. Is it a problem for theology not to be a science? Is it a problem for philosophy not to be a science? Not to my mind. One can exist and not be a science. Now, I'll turn to a respectable philosopher, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger has devoted much attention to the problem of scientificity, to the problem of technology, and, that's my problem today, to the problem of thinking. Let us start with a quotation. It's in a late, small essay by Heidegger. He says, science doesn't think. Now, when you say it, be careful. There may be in your audience a hard scientist with no sense of humor. in which case, he rises like a rocket and says, sir, you don't know what science is. You ignore what enormous intellectual achievement says. Now, when Heidegger says that science doesn't think, he doesn't say that there is no science. He provides, in fact, a very precise description of the achievements of science, which are mathematization, I said it yesterday about Galileo, prediction, and control. After all, philosophy is unable to predict and control anything. Science can. Science can control. Heidegger will say that the fate of science and the fate of technology are more or less one and the same in the modern period. And that precisely he would say that technology doesn't think. Now, the fact that technology doesn't think doesn't say to us that technology doesn't exist. Heidegger, in fact, had described theology as a science when he was young. He gave a lecture in 27, Phenomenology and Theology, and refused to publish it. Had described theology as a science when he was young. He gave a lecture in 1927, Phenomenology and Theology, and refused to publish it. So it was published in a French paper in 1975.